Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us for our webinar today, breaking down the exposure management maturity model. Before we get started, a couple of housekeeping notes. Our runtime today is going to be right around 30 minutes. We hope you're able to stay for the whole thing, but if you are not, we will be sending around a recording, so please watch your email for that. During the presentation, if you have any questions, please feel free to pop those into the chat. If we have time, we will get to those at the end of the presentation. If not, we'll be responding to you over email. And then finally, I want to draw your attention to the additional resources that we have available for you. These include the slides from the presentation today. We also have a deep dive into the exposure management maturity model that we'll be presenting today, which you can use to benchmark your own organization's progress and come up with a targeted plan to continue to improve your maturity. And we also have an interactive assessment that you can take. Our presenters today are Chris Goettl, VP of Product Management for our Exposure Management Solutions, and Rob Lesieur, who is Director of Solutions Marketing for Exposure Management. Rob, I will turn it over to you to kick us off.
Okay, thank you. So I'll cover off on what you should expect today. We're going to start with the improvements that we need to be making on vulnerability management. So what are the issues with it as it exists today? Where do we need to go from there? That will take us into a conversation about the essential capabilities for exposure management, what those deltas are to what we do today, largely using the same tools, but how we're going to apply them differently. And then the maturity model that Rachel spoke of, and what does that maturity model look like? What are the stages in there, and how you can apply it to your organization, and then how you go about doing that yourselves. So with that, let's dive into vulnerability management itself and what the challenges are. So first and foremost is a limited understanding of your attack surface. So do you have a complete view? Most organizations don't. Do you understand what is really at risk with those assets? When we talk about that contextual risk, what that implies is we don't know what role some of these assets play in our organization from a productivity perspective, from a continuity perspective. And in order to be able to adequately determine where you should focus your time, you're going to need to understand what assets mean the most to your organization. Where do you need to spend your time on that? And then lastly, there are today human and resource constraints, and that is focusing on issues like how do teams work together. There's typically silos between security and IT. There is tools that aren't shared between the two, therefore data that's not shared, and it just puts roadblocks in place that results in false sense of security, for example, where if you're focusing on the wrong levels of risk, or if you're looking at risk inappropriately, you may be tackling the wrong vulnerabilities. Typically, that's going to land you in reactive mode, which you're always responding to the latest and greatest, versus looking at what really matters to me, what's strategic to my organization. And all of that results in an increased risk of breach. What I mean by that is if you're not focused in the wrong or in the right place, that you're going to be chasing the wrong vulnerabilities. So all of this is around how do we look at the right vulnerabilities, at the right assets that mean the most to your organization. All of the downsides of not doing that are pretty clear. So with that, let's talk about how we want to manage this.
Yeah, so one of the biggest things that you need to understand about really trying to understand how to shift to more of an exposure management mindset is where we're thinking about the overall process. It's really defining what your organization's risk appetite is, and then ensuring that we can measure that risk posture and try to keep those things in balance. Some organizations may need to be more aggressive. Some may need to be more conservative. Each of your organizations are going to be defining these a little bit differently. Now, what is a risk appetite? You've actually probably already got several of these already pre-decided in your organization. This is just determining what types of risks you're willing to accept and which type you're automatically going to be responding to. This makes it so that if you've defined those risk appetites well, any new finding coming in will be dispositioned and automatically drive through to remediation as quickly as possible based on the definitions that you've put in place. Operating system, a good example. Each month, Microsoft is going to release the Windows OS update on Patch Tuesday. That is something that all of us have decided, hey, we're going to be rolling out that OS update. It's got 40 to 60 CVEs on average, some updates as much as 100 CVEs. That's a lot of risk that we can just automatically decide we're going to roll out. We've probably already got an SLA. We've already got a maintenance schedule for it. All of those are a defined risk appetite. You can define other risk appetites to move faster. Things like organizations that are now deciding to say the browsers release on almost a weekly basis at this point, depending on which browsers you're using typically. Chrome is releasing weekly. Edge, because it's Chromium based, responds typically every week, if not every other week. And Firefox releases about 2 to 3 weeks a month. That means that every single week, I've got additional risk coming in through that browser update. I can respond to that in a more aggressive task where I say, I want to prioritize browser updates to happen more frequently, perhaps weekly, even daily, having a task to check and see, are my browsers up to date? That's another defined risk appetite. So once we've decided on these different risk appetites, we can start to configure for the solutions in our environment, the processes that we have in place to start to drive those remediation activities to keep that risk posture within our determined risk appetite range. So Rob, with that, the kind of the mindset that we're getting into, now let's start to break down and talk a little bit more about some of the more in-depth capabilities of exposure management.
In order to be able to measure and gauge where we are in our risk appetite versus risk posture, we're going to need capabilities that we don't have today. So we need to start with the fundamentals, which I alluded to earlier, that asset visibility is a foundation for all of this. If we do not have that, any sort of extended capability is really not terribly helpful because we don't know what it is we're trying to protect. So once we have the foundational capability, we need to move on to asset importance, which I've also spoken about previously. And that is where we start moving from just understanding that we have this set of assets that we need to protect to how they play a role in the organization. So we can start assigning weighting to these assets to determine which of these assets are going to be the highest priority in terms of remediating or mitigating risk. Once we have that capability, we're adding in contextual vulnerability assessment. And that's referring to largely an existing capability today with tools like risk-based vulnerability management. But the goal of this is to go beyond CVSS scores, which are generic scores, which may or may not apply to a specific organization, adding in more context to that. It could be EPSS, could be KEV, could be any number of things. But the goal is to give you a better view of actual risk for a specific vulnerability and whether it applies or not. And the outcome of this is going to be to actually reduce your vulnerability backlog and to have a better idea of where your priorities need to be. Now, once you have all of that, we move down to the bottom left and we have business-driven vulnerability prioritization. So what we're doing there is we're taking the ability to understand what all the assets are, what their importance is, what the relative risk is for any given vulnerability, putting that all together. And now I'm looking at my assets and I'm looking at the vulnerabilities, which now have better prioritization associated with them. So now I understand where my real risk is and what I need to address first. Once I have that, we move into a new capability, which largely doesn't exist today, and really the crux of the problem with vulnerability management as it is practiced, which is this is a fancy way of talking about balancing what we need to remediate as viewed by a security organization and balancing that against what drives most IT organizations, which is elements of measurement like uptime, how long are assets going to be down if I need to go patch them, what are the effects of mitigating a risk, and what does that stop me from being able to do from a productivity perspective. So you're blending the intents of your security organization and your IT organization to determine what makes the most sense to go take on first, what has to be waited on in order to adequately address it or to meet the needs of the organization. So it gives a more holistic view of what to go do and how to go justify that action, those behaviors to management. And that now starts leading you to a better understanding of what your posture is and to be able to balance your need to address your posture versus your risk appetite. And then lastly is around data and workflow integration. There's much you can do, for example, with operationally balanced remediation prior to getting that workflow integration. But really the ultimate goal is to get to a point where all of this is all linked together in good, healthy processes that have closed loop feedback on how the work is done, when the work is done, what data is being shared. And so from here, we're going to move into a model that you can use. And I'm just going to set this up for Chris. But we talked about those critical capabilities, essential capabilities, which are from top to bottom, again, starting with the basics and moving into the more elaborate and exotic capabilities. And then across the top row are different levels of maturity. And what Chris is going to talk to what each of these may be. And it's not necessarily a goal of being at level 4 for every capability for every organization. So I'll hand it over to Chris to talk to that.
Yeah. So one of the things that a model like this is trying to do, think of this as a rebaselining of how we're approaching this problem. The level 1 is where vulnerability management was, coming into kind of this next stage of evolution. If you talk to the analyst firms, Gartner is going to call it CTEM. If you talk to Forrester, they're going to call it ASM. Really, exposure management is the general term being used for this, but it's trying to take several of the pain points of traditional vulnerability management and evolve that into a larger framework. Asset visibility. This is discovery, trying to understand what's in your environment. If I don't know about it, I can't understand those exposures. So trying to understand that. Well, traditionally, that wasn't directly part of the vulnerability management framework. So that's why you see here in level 1, that may be an unknown or a very disconnected process from your vulnerability management process. Asset importance, as Rob talked about, how do I classify the severity of an asset? Because not everything is treated equally. The real world vulnerability assessment, business driven vulnerability pro, each of these pieces then are now becoming part of a larger framework. So level 1, again, we're going to snap a line there and say that's where traditional vulnerability management was. Now, how can we start to look ahead to where we are as an organization and determine where we are on our journey towards a more mature exposure management mindset? Organizations are not all expected to be at the same level in this journey or even get to the same level in this journey. A very large enterprise with the right resources, the right team members, the skill sets, and the budget to be able to do this, they're going to be trying to aim for something towards that level 3, level 4. A mid-market organization with less resources, less internal skill set for that is probably going to be aiming more for level 2 to level 3 maturity within there. Each organization will be a little bit different. So with that, we're actually going to walk through an example, taking together a lot of conversations we've been having with organizations and giving you an example of what this looks like. So in our example here, we're going to take a mid-sized bank, 1,000 employees. They're at an early stage of this exposure management journey within their organization. They're obviously in a regulated vertical. They've got different requirements that they need to do there. They've got regular audits that they need to adhere to. So their needs to expand this exposure management mindset, this maturity model, are definitely urgent, and they want to start this journey. So their current state is they're running asset scanners monthly, but not sure of their coverage. That may be in pockets. There might be multiple technologies being used to try to understand what's in their environment, but they're not consolidating that into one place for continuous visibility yet. Prioritization of vulnerabilities. They're using a vulnerability scanner, It may have some basic risk-based prioritization using things like the CISA KEV list, the known exploited vulnerabilities list, but they don't have a risk-based vulnerability management platform in place. So they're using primarily CVSS score, vendor severity, and in some cases that CISA KEV list to drive more prioritized remediation actions for just the tip of those known exploited vulnerabilities. Their security analyst informally communicates worrisome CVEs, probably based again on that CISA KEV or other high profile news related items. But that's the extent of their prioritizing a release track other than just their monthly maintenance. And maintaining user uptime is still their priority within their organization. So, with that, if you look at the framework above, you can see that we've kind of outlined in red where this organization is at today. From an asset visibility perspective, they're doing some discovery, but it's incomplete and it's also not being centralized. Asset importance, they may have a few things tracked, but probably via spreadsheets. And a lot of their assets are probably not being tagged with anything more specific than a few known specific groups. CVSS driven, again, they're focused on traditional metrics like CVSS and vendor severity today, and they don't have any business driven vulnerability prioritization other than some security driven prioritization around a very notable CVE that needs to be resolved quickly. So they're doing more of an ad hoc prioritization today. And as far as data workflow and integration, today their security team uses a vulnerability scanning tool. They may have a discovery tool. They've got a patch management solution in place. Each of those things are different isolated data sets and tools within their organization with minimal integration between them. They might have some basics in place, like the ability to do a CVE import into the patch solution to prioritize remediation to a degree, but not a automated integrated platform yet. So they've gone through and they've looked at trying to identify an action plan to move things forward. They want to centralize their asset visibility. And when we talk about saying centralizing that, getting to a critical mass, having a few different solutions in place that are sources of asset data. It might be my Active Directory, my endpoint management solution, my CMDB. Each of those are another source of data. But we need to bring those data silos together to get towards that critical mass, along with a solution that can provide active and passive discovery. So that's their strategy to try to go from discovery in a pocket separate from the vulnerability management processes and bringing that into a point where that can feed into and bring them into a point where they've got visibility into which assets are discovered and which do we have an understanding of exposures on. Asset importance. In there, they want to make sure that the solution that they adopt will be able to bring in at least a basic level of classification, being able to track where or sensitive data is versus end user machines with less security concerns, making sure that they've classified that and have that to be able to shift prioritization. And that's where we get into the vulnerability assessments. They want to bring in a more robust scoring capability. This, if you're looking at solutions in the market today, would be the type of capabilities brought in by a risk-based vulnerability management platform. It's going to go beyond CISA KEV and get to a point where you've got more vulnerabilities that have known exposures and a reassessment of risk on a continuous basis. EPSS is a good example of some mainstream kind of technologies that are doing that across the industry, or a risk-based vulnerability management platform that specializes in doing this type of risk factoring. So now we've got the pieces in place where we can start to do business-driven vulnerability prioritization. With that asset value and that risk calculation, we can now get a better assessment of what's a priority and what's noise that we can just defer to our monthly maintenance and not have to worry about on a regular basis. That then leads us into how we track this. Operationally balanced remediation. Rob spoke about this. Really what this means is now that we've got the right visibility in place, we've got the right metrics in place and the risk calculations, now we can start to define KPIs. This is, again, defining that risk appetite. What types of vulnerabilities do we determine as the type we're going to be tracking? One of our design partners on Ivanti's journey towards developing a platform solution to help organizations achieve this level of maturity was a bank. And this, in part, was defined based on where they were on their journey and how they were evolving. Well, like many of you, you could probably find a line chart that was trying to track somewhere around 95% compliance within your organization and trying to get to having all of your machines resolving CVEs within a time frame and trying to achieve that 95% compliance. They never consistently got to that. They got close occasionally, once or twice a month. But then new vulnerabilities would come out, that would drift down again, and they would just continuously be trying to strive for, but never achieving that baseline. As they redefined and reprioritized things, they changed their KPIs over to a risk-based model. And when they focused on risk and prioritizing things like doing browser updates more frequently, OS updates and other updates continuously each month within a certain SLA, they were able to hit a KPI-driven model where, based on those risk-based metrics, they were at or above compliance near continuously throughout each month. When they were able to share this with their um, auditor was blown away by the level of detail that they were able to show on a continuous basis and was very interested in learning more about how they achieved that level of kind of continuous baseline, because it's very hard to achieve when you're dealing with trying to tackle all vulnerabilities that are constantly coming out. The last piece, the data workflows and integrations, this is where an organization looks to say, okay, from the end to end, how do we bring asset visibility together, drive that into discovering where we've got blind spots in our exposure management, making sure that we're getting continuous assessments and prioritizing remediation as quickly as possible. Not everything is going to be able to be remediated directly. So some things might have to be able to be opened as a ticket, routed to other teams, where those teams are going to have to do things like update an appliance like an edge device or an IoT device. There might be business line teams that need to update platforms like an SAP or something like that, where you can't just do automated remediation. So those green bubbles are where this organization has set their sights on and is starting to build their roadmap towards a successful maturation of their exposure management processes within their organization. Now, with this, we're going to have some assets for you to be able to download. As Rachel said before, make sure to grab those before you leave here today. Otherwise, they will be available later. But that gives us the ability to start to determine where we are today as an organization and start to make a plan on how we move forward. Now, again, you saw that this was a mid-sized organization. They weren't trying to strive for tier or maturity level 4 in their organization. You saw a mix of level 2 and level 3, which was right for the size and complexity of the organization in this example. Each of you will be able to kind of look at that and determine where you're at today and how you want to try to move your journey forward. So, Rob, we've got a few different things here that we're going to be sharing with everybody to get started on that journey.
Yeah, so there are a couple of opportunities for those watching this webinar. One is around a self-assessment and action plan that is being driven through one of our inside organizations. And secondly is a deeper dive into each of the discussion points we've hit on today. So there's a much more in-depth assessment tool that you can use, that you can download, that you'll be able to modify to the needs of your organization. But what it does is it goes into a much deeper dive into how we define these categories, what each of the levels mean, what you should see at the level, what you can potentially measure at that level. There's some guidance around perspective metrics that you can use. And then what is the next step you would take at each of those levels for each capability to move to that next step? And again, you can decide what makes sense for your organization as you do that and put some caps on expectations about what you may want to go achieve. But underpinning all of that is the guidance that you do need to build those foundational capabilities before you start attempting to achieve automation, let's say, in any aspect of this. That is done on a per capability basis after you have those basic capabilities in play.
The business capability self-assessment. This is something that Ivanti's been doing for several years. This goes much broader than the exposure management assessment that we're talking about here. If a larger business capability assessment is something of interest to your organization, you can also follow up on the link in our assets today, and that will let you go out to our website and do a much broader self-assessment than just exposure management. That'll look at aspects of your organization from servicing your organization from a service desk perspective, business continuity, other capabilities, endpoint management, security, exposure management being a subset of capabilities in there as well. But the maturity model that Rob and I discussed today is taking a much deeper view into a specific part of that larger business capability self-assessment. So if you liked the exposure management concept, have a look at that broader business capability self-assessment. And if you're interested, you can engage our teams to do a much more hands-on workshop within your organization with our business team. Thank you for joining us today.
So we have time for one question from the audience. You spoke about creating shared KPIs between IT and security. Can you give some more detailed examples?
Yeah. So I think a good example of that is shifting your KPIs over to focusing on a risk-based approach. So instead of trying to measure all findings that are coming in, we've talked to some organizations where they may be getting hundreds of thousands of findings a quarter, or even some larger organizations who are getting millions of findings each quarter. That's really hard to measure. It's also really hard to maintain. It's mostly noise too, by the way. So shifting your KPIs to focus in on a much more specific set of metrics. What are the number of known exploited vulnerabilities that are resolved under SLA? And as we get into more of that continuous model, think about actually earlier this year, we had a good example. Google Chrome had a pair of 0 days between May Patch Tuesday and June's Patch Tuesday. An organization who's trying to resolve 0-day threats in 7 days, as an example, they would have had to remediate each of those 0-day threats outside of their normal monthly maintenance activities, because they came out just before and just after what most people were executing. So having a KPI that focuses in on very specific things like vulnerabilities that have a known exploit against them, against a specific SLA that's not our normal SLA. So if my maintenance SLA is 14 days, this 0-day response SLA might be 7 days or 48 hours, depending on my organization and how quickly we want to remediate those. So having a KPI to measure normal maintenance, a KPI to measure 0-day response, and priority updates, each of those KPIs are focused on measuring a specific risk appetite within our environment. So back to that earlier discussion, once we've defined our risk appetites, what we really care about, we can start to develop KPIs to measure those specific appetites being met.
Those are all the questions that we have time for today. For those of you who asked questions that we didn't get a chance for, please watch your email. We'll be following up with you directly. One more time, I want to draw your attention to the additional resources that we have available for you. If you'd like to take the business capability self-assessment, or if you would like a deep dive into the exposure management maturity model that we went through today, you can find both of those items there, as well as the slides that we went through today. For myself, for Chris, and for Rob, thank you so much for joining us today.